કરી ગઈ છે મોલાના સાથે આશરા અટેન્ડ કરવાનું અગર નસીબ થાય તો અને દર વર્ષ મોલા એક થીમ રાખે છે જે થીમ અમે આખો વરસ અમે ખ્યાલમાં રાખીને એ અમારો મૌજુ બને છે આખો વરસના વર્ષે આ વરસ અશરા મુબારકા જામિયત સૈફિયા નાયરોબીમાં मौलाना अली ना कलाम मुबारक मासी बरकत लईने बयान फरमाया एमा मौलाना अली एक बयान फरमावे छे तलब तो रियासत फवजदतहु फी तलबल इल्म व तक़वा I sought leadership and I found it by cultivating knowledge and piety because leadership requires more than just knowledge. It is a combination of knowledge and piety. And we are honored now to present a true leader in his field, a man whose entire life is devoted to the study and proliferation of Fatimid culture. Dr. Sheikh Asgar Alibhai is an assistant professor of Islamic art history and material culture at the University of Texas at Dallas and the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History. He joined UT Dallas after graduating with a PhD in Arabic and Islamic studies from Harvard University in 2018. He also holds a degree of Al-Fiqh al-Jayyid from Al-Jamiat al-Sayfiyah. He is the recipient of a very prestigious State Department Fulbright Scholarship and holds teaching appointments both at Al-Jamiat al-Sayfiyah as well as Harvard University. In my opinion, more interestingly, Dr. Alibhai has also co-founded an art and decor company with his wife called The Arabesque. That's a free sponsorship, by the way. With the intent of disseminating Fatimid culture and style more broadly. There's a saying that past is prologue and history has immense lessons for us. It's my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Sheikh Asgar Alibhai to educate us on the history of medicine, lessons from the history of medicine in a post-pandemic world. Dr. Saab.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. A'udhu billahi samil alim minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Bihi wa biwaliyihi wa bida'ihi Sayyidina Mufaddal Saifuddin Asta'inu fi Jamil Umur. I'm very excited to be here today, and I thought that I would start to talk about the history of medicine in my family, first of all. My father was an OBGYN. He came to the United States. He always told us that he kind of sacrificed everything, escaped Africa by the hair of their chins to get to like Uganda in the Idi Amin time to get to the United States. Then all of a sudden at the age of 12 and 13, my brother, Dr. Mustafa, and I decided to go to Jamia Sayfiyah. And at that time in the 90s, my father was like, I came all the way across the world to educate you here, and now you're going somewhere else. But because of the irshadat of Sadat Kiram and the sort of faith in Akamola and Akamola's institutions, we ended up going. But then that led my brother and I through different paths. We were actually sent together in two different paths. And so he came back and he decided to become a medical doctor, and I decided to become a real doctor. Now, we've all heard about sort of, we're working on our social illnesses at the moment, and part of those social illnesses is kind of toxic masculinity. Well, in my household, we didn't really have toxic masculinity. We had more toxic academia. And in toxic academia, oh, sorry, maybe it's not. I feel like I'm doing a TED Talk. So in my household, we had toxic academia. And so toxic academia would be like, oh my gosh, my older brother is a genius, works for Price Waterhouse. And then Mustafa and me, because we were so close in age, literally we're about 15 months apart, so we were always like, we literally fought for the same room. And so we had this competition going on, and then he said, well, I'm a doctor. And then I said, well, no, I'm a doctor. I'm a real doctor. And so I would always say that medical doctors actually come from a tradition of being barbers and being sort of haircutters, while I come from a tradition of philosophy and safeguarding knowledge and being part of a guild of scholars that really perpetuate knowledge and make sure that knowledge stays perpetual in society. And then COVID happened. Now, when COVID happened, all of a sudden I felt powerless, and my sort of toxic academia that I had towards medical doctors and practitioners, especially most of my family members who always reminded me of the life choices I made, kind of changed. And that was a lot because in Dallas we had an extra special doctor, Dr. Salma Saigar, who ensured that every woman in our Jamaat was vaccinated as the law allowed at that time. And so luckily, my weight went over a little bit of the thing, and so I was right and ran to Salma Ben's clinic and said, please sign me up. And throughout the month, Salma Ben made sure that all mu'mineen in our Jamaat were vaccinated. And so that's kind of what I wanted to start with. When the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding is an institute of a wide range of anthropologists and scholars who work on Muslim communities in the United States, and they work on kind of accumulating data to understand how Muslim societies function, what decisions do they make, and how can we change policy in the United States to sort of be inclusive for Muslim societies. What they found, and this was in April 2021, is that American Muslims actually surprisingly, in a lot, if you took the whole population, there was a slight hesitancy to take the COVID-19 vaccine. This was something that I didn't know until I looked at this research. In fact, it was only 35% of Muslims that said that they would get the vaccine as soon as they could. If we look at more numbers in the way that they conducted that study, and this was, again, mind you, April 2021, so a lot of groups were not even eligible at that time. But they also found that Muslim women, more than Muslim men, conveyed a larger hesitancy to the COVID vaccine. And more surprisingly, and this might have obscured the data a little bit, is that younger Muslims were more likely than older Muslims to be vaccine hesitant. And perhaps at the time, I mean, all the young people who were going maskless and just thought that, I mean, I know my nephews and nieces were kind of the same way, and I was like, please stay away from me. But there was kind of a hesitancy for younger people to get the vaccine because they always think they're invincible until they turn 35. And there was actually, surprisingly, 1/4 of older Muslims who intended never to get the vaccine. Now, if we look at these statistics in demographics, obviously we fall under the smallest bracket of people who would likely get the vaccine, Asian Muslims. And there's a lot of reasons for this. First of all, it's surprising to know that 1 out of 10 medical professionals, or 1 out of 10 Muslims in the United States actually work in some form or capacity in the health industry, 1/10. And I think our Mu'min numbers will probably equal up to that. So out of that, a majority of Muslims in America are South Asian descent, right? And so we fall under that number, but we, as we know, because of Akamolla's guidance and the fact that we did not have a hesitancy, we did not have a cultural hesitancy to take the vaccine, even though we believe in spiritual cures, dua, and all these other elements of what we would call sort of Islamic practices to healing ourselves. At the same time, our culture doesn't really have a hesitancy to practicing medicine or receiving medical care. But that does not mean that sort of culture does not play a part in our medical decisions. So I kind of wanted to give the talk today to kind of understand what were the reasons that there was no hesitancy. That, I mean, besides Akamolla's Farman, it's a cultural push together as well that we have 100% vaccination rate. We have 100% vaccination rate in all Jamaats around the United States and probably across the world at this point. So I wanted to kind of understand what role does culture play in medical treatment and care? What role does tradition play and culture play in understanding our decisions for healthcare? I can't talk from the experience of a doctor, but I can talk from the experience of a patient who goes to seek medical care. So I looked at another study and saw that there is a direct correlation between Islamic teachings, especially for Muslims, conducted in this study, and healthcare seeking patterns. And so this is why some of you might ask, why is a historian of culture and material culture and art history presenting at a medical conference? Trust me, I asked myself that question several times. But there are kind of direct correlations. In this paper that I read, The Islamic Tradition and Health Inequities, they sort of looked at several different reasons that there are inequities for Muslim Americans sort of seeking medical health care. One is obviously legal regulations, what we would call, we always say, jo am manache, am natai. For us, this is pretty simple for us, but there's a lot of things in ilmul fiqh and also Aqamas Farman and culture of why we wouldn't take a certain treatment. There's pretty simple ones. There's a great, I'm sorry, I'm going to talk medicine and I'm going to sound not as sophisticated, but I know that there's a cardiovascular heart health drug or some, I'm sorry, I'm going to sound stupid, that is made from porcine enzymes, or there's something in there in the ingredients. Obviously, if people get valve transplants, they have a choice between bovine transplants or or porcine sort of valves. And in the future, as we know, that as transplants become more successful of transferring pig hearts into human bodies, these are all going to be issues that are going to be relevant to our health choices and the connection between our culture and the practice of medicine. So as Muslim doctors, it's important then to find these innovations and to lead these innovations in a way that will work for the cultural decisions that our communities have to make. Now the problem there is that we live in a society that we are an uber minority. And so how do we sort of maneuver that in the best way possible to give the best medical care to our community? These are questions that I'm posing to you. I obviously don't have the answers. Another thing that is considered in medical care, often according to this study, are ethical values. This I can know personally from experience of taking my wife to the OBGYN and the fear that she had from a pap smear. This is one of the examples that's given in the paper. These are sort of things that sometimes things come in the way, or cultural factors come in the way in which patients are hesitant to seek health care. Now, also, in Muslim societies, and this is where we differ a little bit, some people will really favor belief in spiritual and religious healing, which we'll call prophetic medicine, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they sort of put that on top of seeking actual medical care. Now, the way that our guidance has been from Awliyaullah Kiram is that there's always a mix of both. We don't reject medical practices, and we don't reject spiritual. Obviously, we don't preference one over the other. We actually treat ourselves in tandem with both. Now, there's also gender-related issues, modesty, same-sex providers, making sure that women obviously want to be treated by women, men want it to be treated by men. These are factors as well that sort of come into play regularly when Muslims are seeking care. And then there's a factor that as a patient, I also have felt many times. And this is something that I think our community is extraordinary in alleviating this problem. And that is social discrimination and abuse due to being a Muslim in America. Sometimes you're hesitant to go to a doctor. You're hesitant to know what that doctor is, how that doctor is going to treat you. Is that doctor going to treat you differently? Is that doctor going to see you as a human? And that's why often we find a lot of solace and a lot of peace in going to a Muslim doctor. And in our communities, we've created systems and networks in which it's easy for Momineen to feel that level of comfort, to say that I'd rather go to a Momin doctor because this person sees me. This person understands all these cultural factors. Now, as medical practitioners, it's up to you to understand the wide variety of cultural factors in a diverse society. So inclusion and diversity in medicine really also includes intellectual diversity. It's not just about race, religion, but it's also about understanding the diversity of thought in which your patient is making their medical decisions. And that's a hard thing to do, but this is why the humanities, things that I teach, the doctor that I am, can work in tandem with the doctors and the professions that you provide as well. So going on, if we can establish that there are correlations between culture and medicine, and as Dawoodi Bohra doctors in this room and other medical professionals and health practitioners, I wanted to ask the question together, what does our tradition and our history tell us about medicine? How does that really affect the way that medicine is practiced and doctors operate within our community? Dr. Alibhai Al-Qamari is here. There's a story, as long as many sort of spouts that we get into, she has one up on me because a few years ago, well, not a few years ago, my daughter's 13 now, but when she was born 2 months premature. And we were in Boston. My mom could not make it because my father had just passed away a week before. And I didn't know who else to call. I just landed in Boston, and my wife had gone into labor. So we would call Alibhai for everything. If I was in a foreign country, I'd call Alibhai that, hey, Alibhai, I have a mold on my back. Can you take a picture of it? So we called Alibhai, Dr. Al-Qamari, to come to the hospital. So she came to the hospital. She stayed 2 nights in the hospital with us. And then, for some reason, my wife went out of labor. But that's another story for another time. And then Alibhai said, okay, fine, I don't think anything's happening now. Now I can go. And the only thing I don't understand about that story is that she went straight, after staying 2 days in the hospital, to the clinic, but that's another story. But she has one up on me for my entire life because I will never forget what she did for us. But the question is that where does that momentum, where does that sort of love for medicine, for care come from? Does it come because you gave a Hippocratic oath? I mean, is the Hippocratic oath of course it's sacrosanct to medicine, but does that sort of equal the care that you give to Momineen and other people? I would say that we could dig a little deeper and understand how does the Hippocratic oath fall into Islamic practices of medicine, and in particular, Fatimid practices of medicine. So I wanted to sort of talk throughout the day, and please let me know when my time is about 15 minutes over. I'm a rambling professor, I talk a lot. But I wanted to talk today with you guys about the Islamic medicine and historical perspective. And so we're going to sort of briefly talk about Islamic theoretical understandings of medicine. How did they develop? What were the major understandings of how Muslims back after the period of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi understood medicine, and how did that develop in Fatimid times? We're also going to be looking at general medical, medieval Islamic categories of medicine. At the same time, we will look at medieval Islamic approaches to pharmacology, which was a big field during that time. And we will then go on to the idea of prophetic medicine. And then we'll look at the history of medical practice in Islamic civilization and go on to, and some of these will be mixed together, and the establishment of the Islamic hospital. And this is something that I really want to talk about. And then finally, I want to sort of tie this up with Fatimi approaches to medicine, both historically and modern. So, Islamic theoretical understandings of medicine. Ibn Sina, who Akamullah just spoke about in a wa'az a few years ago, especially during when the pandemic was happening, he has an important quote in which he says, medicine, according to the medieval Islamic understanding, is a science from which one learns the states of the human body. So kind of what's going on in the human body at the time. And then in order to preserve good health when it exists is an objective of medicine, and to restore it when it's lacking. Not much has changed. I think this is kind of still the general idea of medicine. But how did medicine develop as a field in Islam? Today, we kind of understand medicine to be coming from the West and kind of a Western idea of medicine. And often in the way that it's taught in schools, and myself as an academic in universities that are in the United States, the story of Islam gets glossed over, it often gets skipped over, and the importance that Muslims and Islam played in the development of medicine and the transmission of medical knowledge from the ancient world to the modern world is often left out. And so today, in a nutshell, I kind of wanted to give you guys a 101 express lesson, so I'll test you guys later about it. But Islam, as we know, sort of started in Mecca and Medina, here in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in the 7th century and around 610. And you can see that the Arabian Peninsula at that time was cradled between two of the world's greatest civilizations at the time. So it's kind of understanding Alaska sort of pinned in between the United States and the USSR in the 80s. To the west, we had the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, if we listen to the Vaz Mubarak a lot of times, we often hear the word Rum or Rum Nabatsha. These were the Byzantines at the time when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi started in 610 with the first message of Islam. To the east, we had the great Sasanian Empire, and that were the Persians. And so these were actually world powers at the time. These were the two major world powers at the time. So towards the west, the Byzantine Empire, you can kind of say, here's the Arabian Peninsula, here's where the Sasanians and where Iraq and Iran starts, and then here where sort of Syria and Palestine is and Egypt is, all the way across from North Africa to the southern Spain and Italy. That was all around 565. This was the Byzantine world that we call Rum. So Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi's Pedaish was around 570, so this is what the Western world looked like when Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi was born. Towards the east, we had a lot of different empires. This is actually an older map, but the reason I'm showing the eastern part of the world is that often in the Western tradition is prefaced over Eastern traditions of medicine, Eastern traditions of ideas, Eastern traditions of science. But the trade routes, the Silk Road, we all know about. And so anytime you have a trade route, you always have people, ideas, and migrating alongside goods and commodities. So you kind of have ideas coming from India, from China, going across Central Asia, and then following their way into the Middle East. And you see the Arabian Peninsula sort of cradled between these two worlds of trade between East and West. So what does that mean kind of for the history of Islam and the history of medicine? Here's Mecca and Medina, and so this sort of red area is the extent of where Islam spread up until the wafat of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi in 632 CE. And you can see afterwards, in the time that Amir al-Mu'mineen was Imam, all the way to around 661, Islam spreads all the way to Afghanistan, across Egypt to what is modern-day Libya. And then eventually, in the next 100 years, so Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi's wafat was in 632 CE, in about 710, so only 80 years after Rasulullah's wafat, the Islamic Empire was kind of all the way to the borders of China, the borders of India, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean, and crossed over into Europe. That's a vast amount of territory. And so what that means is that, again, if people are moving, migration is happening, ideas are moving, science is moving, technology is moving across these borders. So in around 750, this is kind of the extent of what the Islamic world looked like, or the Abbasid Empire that we'll call it. And it was sort of centered in Baghdad, so right over here. And you can see that what was once Sasanian, what was once Byzantine, is now the Islamic world. So what does that mean for the history of medicine? This means that ideas, knowledge, are all coming to the central metropolitan area of the Islamic world at that time, which is Abbasid Baghdad, in the late 8th century, early 9th century. And so this is sort of an imaginary image of Baghdad, the round city that was built by the Abbasids. And in that city, there was a palace, there was obviously buildings, and at the same time, the Abbasids bring in a movement of translating Greek texts, Indian texts, Eastern texts, and texts that had been preserved from the ancient world into Arabic. And so there's this mass movement of translation happening in which medical sciences are also translated into Arabic. And so they create a library there called the Bayt al-Hikmah, which a lot of people misunderstand as being the world's first university. It was actually a repository for books. So it was full with scholars kind of writing down and copying these books and translating them from Greek, from Sanskrit, from Pahlavi, which was the Persian Sasanian language, and Latin texts all into Arabic. And so Arab culture and Muslim culture become the corpus, they become the center of scientific learning for the next several hundred years. This is the same time that people are forgetting about ideals. They're forgetting about religious morality up to a certain extent. And this is where the Mu'jiza of Ikhwan al-Safa, which was written by Imam Ahmad al-Mastur, is also written. Because Imam Ahmad al-Mastur takes those same philosophies, takes those same sciences, takes those same Greek philosophical ideas of understanding the world around us, and brings those ideas into an Islamic fold so that people understand the oneness of Khuda Ta'ala and the emphasis of Fatimi philosophy mixed with the sciences. Now, other developments that are happening at this time, we talked about the Baghdad kind of right here in the center of this east and west nexus, and at the same time then the Sasanian world was absorbed. The Persian world, that old empire, that old world power was absorbed into the Islamic world. So what did that mean for the history of medicine? In the Sasanian world, before Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wa alihi, there was a really important city in the Sasanian Empire called Gunde Shahpur. Now, Gunde Shahpur was a city that was renowned for its doctors. It was renowned for sciences coming from India, from China, and also from the Byzantine and Greek world, and it had a hospital and a school for medicine in which doctors were being trained. Those doctors came, and those scientists came from Gunde Shahpur to this new center of the world, Baghdad, and they decided to start practicing medicine. They were actually called there. And so we have all of these manuscripts of sciences being written. This is just one. It's a little bit of biology, so I'm taking you a little bit out of medicine, but it's just because I love animals. But this was a zoological treatise called the Na'tul Hayawan, which was kind of the praise of animals. And what you can see here are peacocks, elephants, rabbits, and of course, the unicorn. Now, what this book did was that it had, and these were the types of science books that were being written at the time. It would tell the properties of the animal, what was important for the animal, and then how you could use that animal for medicinal value. This book was written by Jibril ibn Bakhtishu in the 9th century. Now, the Ibn Bakhtishus were a family of doctors that came from Gunde Shahpur to Baghdad in the 8th century, and they served in Baghdad as sort of the prime chief physicians of this city, responsible for a lot of the translation movement that happened in the medical sciences. And you can kind of see this when you look at the art in these manuscripts. On the left, we're going to be talking about this manuscript. It's the miniature from Dioscorides. Dioscorides was a 1st century Roman physician, probably worked in the Roman military, and he was probably a surgeon and also a medical doctor in the ancient Roman world. And because he was in the military, he dealt with a lot of illness, a lot of wounds, and so his entire book is about pharmacology and understanding which plants will be beneficial in treating wounds and different illnesses. That book, on the left, you can see the Byzantine copy of it, and on the right, you can see how it was translated. And the art, you can see that here is sort of a Byzantine Roman-looking figure handing over a plant, and on the left, you can kind of see the Islamic version of it, still set within architecture, but you can see the turbans, you can see the beard, and this is kind of the pupil and the master, Dioscorides himself, handing over a plant for medicinal value to his student, his pupil. Can anyone tell me what plant that is? Sorry? Think more Harry Potter. Not quite. If you kind of look at the shape, there's like this two things, a torso and kind of legs, same thing in the Islamic thing. Sorry? A mandrake, there we go, 10 points for Gryffindor. So the mandrake was a root, obviously, with medicinal value. J.K. Rowling was inspired by this, and this is why she kind of brings it into the book. But these are the types of plants that were kind of introduced of their medicinal values. And we'll talk about that in a little, because this is one of the few manuscripts with a lot of medical manuscripts, pharmacology manuscripts with a lot of illustration. But in that translation, the general Islamic doctor of that time period followed a Galenic understanding of medicine. So Galen was also an ancient physician, and so the Galenic model of medicine really was based on understanding that the human body, in that thing that we saw of Ibn Sina, that quote of sort of understanding that the human body is built up of the four humors. The four humors are, each body contains a certain amount of blood, a certain amount of yellow bile, a certain amount of black bile, and a certain amount of phlegm. And so when these four elements in the body, or these four humors, are in harmony with the other elements of the body, which are moisture, hotness, dryness, and coldness, when everything is kind of in balance with one another, in balance with so this is the microcosm, the smaller universe that is encompassed within a larger universe. And so when that is in tandem and in harmony with kind of steps of life and with the planetary movements and the zodiacs, this is when someone is in perfect health. So the medieval doctor's Galenic approach to medicine was to kind of make sure that the 6 non-naturals, these non-naturals were kind of ambient air, food and drink, exercise and rest, sleep and wakefulness, excretion and retention, and passions of the soul. So in other times, it was kind of that these constituted a kind of hygiene or regimen. People cannot avoid the effects of these elements, these 6 non-naturals, in their lifetime. So physicians were required to learn about them, not only to treat diseases, but to preserve health and to prevent diseases. So what the medieval Islamic doctor did was make sure that they were treating their patients to bring both the 6 non-naturals, which were a necessity for human survival, in which they would look at observations in different ways and different behaviors of how they could come to these 6 non-naturals, with the 4 humors and bringing it all into balance. How did they do this? Of course, I talked to Tasneem and Raja yesterday and included this slide last night. One of the main ideas that we know from medieval medicine is that bloodletting, right? Hijamat. And today, this is, we technically call Urdu speakers, yes? No, oh no, I was more talking about hajams, which is the barber, which goes back to the fight that I have with my brother, that like, you're a barber, I'm a real doctor. But the idea, hijamat is the idea of bloodletting. And so what you can see here in this medieval manuscript from the 13th century is actually the practitioner cupping and bloodletting here and taking out blood. And so the idea of taking out blood from the body was to bring these 4 humors into balance. And it wasn't only that. So there was also this idea of pharmacology. And what we have here is a 9th century papyrus from Egypt, dating to the Abbasid era, when the Abbasids kind of ruled Egypt, but it's the oldest prescription of medicine that we have, maybe in the world, but definitely in the Islamic world. And what the prescription kind of writes is that they would start with Bismillah, this is a partial inscription, and then it said, mix aloe with barley for fever, it is drunk with coriander water, and for colic and dysentery, it is drunk with lukewarm water, and for bites of the scorpion and the viper, it is drunk with cold water. So you can sort of understand how they are mixing ideas of the heats and the body and coldness and moisture and plant life into sort of manipulating the body to bring those 4 humors. Now, the point of this talk today is not to say that, oh, well, there must be some element of science behind this. Many of these things can't be scientifically proven. They were practiced for so long because they worked at the time. I always think that, we always take Tylenol for headaches, and in 50 years or so, people are going to think that we were really stupid for taking Tylenol for every headache. I'm not sure. Because acetaminophen, right? Or it might not be the best thing, and we might find something better in the future, and people will say, like, hey, that was pretty stupid. Well, this is kind of the same idea. I'm not trying to say that medieval medicine is the way to go. I'm just saying is that this is the depth of knowledge that and scientists and doctors were going to practice medicine, and this is the tradition that you all come from. Interestingly enough, the United States and the National Institute of Health and in the National Library of Medicine has the 3rd largest collection of Islamic manuscripts in the world. The 3rd largest collection of Islamic manuscripts in the world. You can go there, it's entirely free. The manuscripts are up there online. You can go there and study them. And it's really interesting to see this. In fact, some of these manuscripts are the only manuscripts that actually exist in the world at this time. Now, I want to go on and sort of understand what were the categories then in which medicine was practiced during this time period. We sort of talked about principles and theories. But if we talk about medieval Islamic medicine and we talk about how it sort of was split up into different categories, this is where it gets really interesting. Because it wasn't just the 4 humors, but they obviously created a lot of subfields. So what were these subfields? Understanding bodily function was really important. The pneuma in Greek means the breath, and so even today we say "Ke'enu akhri saas lidu," right? Like his last breath. The breath and the way that oxygen flowed in the body and air moved in the body was understood as the way that life functioned, and so to understand how the body functioned was one of the major elements of Islamic medicine and research, and this is what you'll find in those manuscripts. Another thing that you'll find is mind and body, and that's sort of the health, the mental health of an individual, and how that mental health can be brought up from either religious or piety. Remember, Dr. Alibhai talked about sort of the mixture of piety and medical sciences together, and this is why we're all here. Ibn Sina wrote a book called Kitab al-Shifa, and he talks about how philosophy cures the soul. On the same note, there was regimen and diet. So the first approach would not be kind of my brother's approach of like, we're the surgeons, we're just going to cut you open, but it was more regimen and diet, non-interventionist techniques or holistic approaches. And then another thing that you'll find in those books is pharmacology, the mixture of medicine, where to find those plants, where to find the different materials to mix medicine together, what is beneficial, what gives cures, what gives ailments for certain diseases. Another thing you'll find in these manuscripts is diagnosis and prognosis. They loved looking at the pulse as a measure for diagnosis, and also, as I think this has not changed even today, urine is a very good favorite of understanding medical disease at the time. Now, at this time, what Muslim doctors take a step further from Galenic medicine is that they are able to actually make direct connections with disease and parts of the body. For instance, at a whole thing, diseases like smallpox and hemophilia were actually discovered by Muslim doctors or described by them. A lot of people suggest that Muslims circumcised their young, so therefore hemophilia was more made aware of than it would have in the Greek world, where they didn't circumcise their young, and therefore that is why hemophilia was understood better by Muslim doctors and their development and their addition to Galenic medicine. It's not just that they inherited these sciences and went with it. No, there was research and development going on continuously through this era. And truly, there were, and we'll talk about this when we get to hospitals, there were institutions of learning and teaching, and it was not like the West at this time, at the same period that we're talking about, in which actually doctors were barbers and pulling out teeth and other things at that time. The Islamic world was actually much far advanced in terms of medicine. As this science progresses, in the 14th century, we actually have, and so the 14th century, just to put it in context, this is the time of Yaman Duato, we actually have anatomy charts of skeletal, vascular systems, and organs being charted and taught to medical students during this time. And so again, this is the progression of medicine during that era. How am I on time? Am I okay? Okay. Now, the next thing I would like to move on to is also more theoretics and so those were just general ones, and I'm going to sort of gloss over them. But there was also, and because we're just coming out of the Corona age, there was a deep understanding of epidemics and pandemics during that time. The meaning of epidemic, al-wafida, was an illness, and that it encompassed, and so one of the definitions of it was that it encompassed many people in one land at one time. This is a medieval definition of what an epidemic is. One type of epidemic is called a motan. The word mot we know means death, and so motan means something that causes a lot of death, and so that would be the word for plague. And so the definition by Ibn Radwan, who's writing in the 11th century, this would be contemporary to Ahmad Fatimid, he says that epidemic diseases have many causes that may be grouped into 4 kinds, and so he understands epidemics as coming from 4 different sources, either change in quality of air, change in quality of water, change in quality of food, and change in quality of psychic events. And so this also points out to the fact that mental illness and mass mental illness, for instance, gun control in this country, I would believe is one of these factors. It's an epidemic of some sort, which I think the medical community should take under their belt, but we'll talk about that another time because I have family members who love to hunt. So Ibn Radwan is writing in the 11th century, and this is sort of his definitions of an epidemic. So in these texts, we also find definitions of epidemics and pandemics. And this is for my brother. Surgery was also a big thing in the medieval world. We have a book written in the 11th century by Ibn Zahrawi. He was in Spain at the time, across the Mediterranean from Qahira. But in his book, Kitab al-Tasrif, he talks about many descriptions of operations that were taken during that time, instructions on surgical procedures, and because he was a surgeon, there's vivid descriptions of anatomical science at the time. And then, most interestingly, as you can see in a later copy of this 11th century manuscript, are descriptions of surgical tools and instruments. In fact, the manuscript tells us of over 200 different instruments that were used in surgery during that time. Now, more speakingly, there was a lot of research going into medical science. So we have Ibn Haytham, who I'll talk about later, but Ibn Haytham comes to the Fatimid court during Imam Hakin's time, and ophthalmology was also a big field in medieval Islamic medicine. There were oculists, people interested in eyesight and how the eye operated. And Ibn Haytham is the first person to, and we'll look at this later on because he's from the Fatimid period, but he's the first person to understand that light did not begin in the eye, but it's actually what we're seeing is a process of light coming into the eye and being processed by the brain. This is the first time that medical science sort of catches up to him. He wasn't a doctor himself, but he looks at physics and maths to understand this. Another component that you'll find in these texts is something that we are more familiar with, and that is prophetic medicine. Prophetic medicine means, in our terms at least, remedies that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi or A'immat Tahirin or Duat Muttaqin have prescribed to us, and I don't think I need to explain this to anybody in this room, but shunez or kilonji and honey is an example of prophetic medicine. Now, I won't call this a disclaimer on the right, but actually a claimer, because Maulana Qadir Noman talks about the properties of prophetic medicine and says that if you're doing it as an experiment to see if this works, then it's not going to work for you. The main component for prophetic medicine is to have an actual, genuine belief that this prescription, this remedy, is coming from A'immat Tahirin, Duat Mutlaqin, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi. And if you believe in that spirituality, then only will the spirituality of these medical remedies work for you. And so the barakat and blessings and the healing, the shifa that you will receive from these types of prophetic medicines will only come with that side factor. So these different types, this is just one type of remedy. Daimul Islam is full of many, and then there's other books written during the medieval Islamic period which really talk about the extent of prophetic medicine as a genre of its own. What's interesting about the Islamic world is that many doctors combine prophetic medicine with Galenic medicine to understand how you could use both spirituality and medical sciences to treat wounds, illnesses, diseases, etc. And this is the approach that we come from. Now, medieval Islamic approaches to pharmacology. I'm just going to go through images here because I think this is the time where you're like, I'm tired of his voice, so let's use our eyes for a little bit. Islamic pharmacology is full of vivid images and illustrated manuscripts in the medieval Islamic world of manuals of how to mix certain drugs to create certain potions or certain medicines to treat certain illnesses. This is a really interesting one. It's called the Kitab al-Diryak. The word tiryak is actually a Greek word, which was the potion made by generations of different doctors who are here represented at the beginning of this book of teaching a recipe of medicine after medicine to their pupils and passing it on until like 12 doctors finally come to the time when this book is written in the 12th century, in which tiryak or diryak is created, which is the potion to treat snake venom, something that was always sought out for during that time. But one of the major books on pharmacology in the medieval Islamic world with many copies is the De Materia Medica, and we talked about this earlier on. This is the book that was written by Dioscorides, who was a physician in the Roman army in the 1st century. This book came to the Islamic world vis-a-vis the Byzantines, so once the Islamic world sort of stretches into Byzantine territory, all of these books become Arabic, like we talked about earlier, and so the book, just like the Mandrake and your Gryffindor points, is basically different plants and images of different plants and how those different plants can be mixed together with different recipes to create different drugs for different illnesses. And so here on the left, you have a physician here sort of preparing elixir, or a pharmacist. Over here, you have men sort of treading grapes to create the liquid part of the medicine, in which they're going to mix other things into it. And it's always done from sort of a master to apprentice. So here again, you can kind of see the physician telling sort of the pharmacist what to do. This is a very American type of model of pharmacy, because pharmacists out here, if you go get to the pharmacy in like Morocco or another country, like the pharmacist will actually treat you and give you what you need, and you can get antibiotics. And here, like, oh my gosh, dealing with pharmacies here is probably the bane of my existence. I turn into a Karen right away when I go to CVS, but that's a story for my therapist. Here's sort of a physician treating a blindfolded man. Obviously, anesthetics probably were not at their top level, so it was probably smart to blindfold someone so they didn't know what the person in the back is doing. But this is kind of what do you call the nurse who helps in the OR? Yeah, that's the medieval version of that. And so here's the doctor kind of telling the nurse what to do. Here is a patient who's like begging the doctor to kind of treat them. And this is my favorite. This is actually a pharmacy scene from the 13th century, in which you can kind of see, here's the doctor, again, the physician sort of telling the chemist what to do, what to put in there, and they're making an elixir of medicine that's made from honey and a whole bunch of different materials. You can kind of see the different materials being stored at the top of the pharmacy in these jars, and chemists kind of mixing everything up until the final medicine is made and drunk. And so this is one of the earliest images that we have of a pharmacy in the Islamic world, and also the world. I mean, this is probably one of the oldest images of pharmacy that we have in general. More interestingly, it wasn't just natural elements. Well, I mean, this is natural, but it was also clay, and finding specific clay and specific properties of the earth was also another way in which medicine was treated during that time period. And so you can have two men here kind of in the fields looking for clay. And here's two physicians cutting a plant. Now, all of this, the point that I wanted to get to is, can we say then, is socialized medicine, Dr. Alibhai Al-Qamri, Dr. Josefa Barmal, who I go to for free now since I've been to Dallas every time I go to his clinic, and who has he will never charge a moment. His staff knows if someone comes in there, they just do not charge a moment. And this type of, when I tell my friends about this at school or my colleagues, they're like, what kind of community do you live in? And I'm like, well, I haven't even told you about Faiz Moayed yet. But we do work towards a socialized community of harmony. And so did this come from Charlton Methodist or like Baylor, which are really great Christian models of medicine and charity, or did it really come from us? And this is why you guys, in my experience, take that extra step, Dr. Salma Saiger, to make sure that we're all treated and medically, the whole society is healthy in many ways. Now, this is just an example that I wanted to give, that concept. I couldn't find a Fatimid example, but this is an example from 10th century medieval Baghdad. But it's sort of this idea of Medicaid for all. Sorry, I was a Bernie supporter. But I have thought, this was sort of a 10th century wazir from the Abbasid court talking about social medicine. And he says, I have thought about those people who live in the Sawad. The Sawad was kind of the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates, where sort of the rural areas were, and where the farming took place. It's the Fertile Crescent after all. It is possible that there are patients to whom no practitioner is close by. Because the Sawad is far away from physicians who were located in Baghdad, therefore order, may God prolong your life, that practitioners be recruited who have stores of drugs and potions at their disposal. This reminded me of all of you who go to those camps in Ashara and bring all those Tylenols and stuff like that, especially in places remote in Yemen, and take that with you. But you are kind of providing medicine. So did it come from your Hippocratic Oath? Which, yes, it did, but where did that come from? The Hippocratic Oath was preserved through these manuscripts and then transferred itself to Europe. But they should make their rounds in the Sawad and stay in each place as long as necessary, treating patients there, and they should travel to the next place. And this is hopefully a model that I think the American doctors will be able to do in the future. But the last point that I would like to make is the establishment of the hospital. The Byzantines had a Xenodokia, which was a Byzantine hospital, and the word for, the medieval Islamic word for hospital was Bimaristan. We know what that means, right? Pakistan, Bimaristan, but a place for the sick, right? Again, I'll go back real quick, is that we talked about Baghdad being in the middle. We talked about Gundeshapur, which is in present-day Iran, in which doctors traveled to the Islamic world where there was a hospital. So medieval Baghdad had a famous hospital called the Al-Mustansiriya Hospital, and a lot of different hospitals that were commissioned by royal people. Now, medieval Islamic hospitals were there to treat the poor. They weren't for the rich people. The rich people had housed, my brother has a concierge doctor. It's a fancy thing nowadays. And so everyone gets treated by that. Not Mustafa, he's my concierge doctor. But Shabir Bhai has like a fancy concierge doctor that treats the whole family. Al-Mustansiriya Hospital was kind of built in Baghdad, and different hospitals for different people. But now let's get to the final point, because Dr. Amir showed me my 5-minute sign, and now I'm going to get a little bit anxious. But we actually have a deep history, and this is something that I'm working on, of Fatimid medicine. All the way from the beginning. So we talked about the Abbasid Empire, now let's talk about the Fatimid Empire. The Fatimid Empire begins in 909 when Imam Mehdi does Zuhur from North Africa. When Imam Mehdi left Syria to go to Damascus, he only had 5 people with him, 5 or 6. And then in 909, he creates a new court in Africa, and in that court, there are doctors, there are practitioners, there are all types of members of society. One person was Ibn al-Jazar. So as I said, Ibn al-Jazar wasn't treating people in the palace. Imam had his own medical crew with him. He was actually treating people in society. And so I'm not going to go through all of the things that he does, but the book is just full. His book is called The Traveler's Medical Handbook. It was preserved for years, and it's on different illnesses and how they can be treated. It has diabetes. It has things on alopecia. Will Smith's not here, right? It even has gynecological issues, and this is something that is really important, and this is the point that I wanted to make today. In the medieval period, we had female doctors, we had female practitioners that were often in competition with male practitioners who would complain because male practitioners still complain about female practitioners. Alifia, I'm with you, where are you? Ibn al-Jazar basically also covers a range of gynecological issues that we don't see in other books. He talks about menstrual problems, hysterical suffocation, sexual wellness, uterus tumors, and also pregnancy, labor, abortion, infertility, contraception, and several issues that many of you have been pregnant that you've complained about today. I had to go get fries from McDonald's in the middle of the night. But it's like, let us prescribe women some remedies to soothe the stomach from outside, such as nard or mastic oil, absinthe oil, and aromatic plasters, especially during the first period of pregnancy. As soon as the moment of delivery approaches, it's necessary for pregnant women to accustom using thermal baths and moisturizing ointments and consume a light diet. Again, the feet, what can you do to help swelling feet in pregnant women? So a range of issues. In Imam Hakim's court, we had an ophthalmologist named Ibn Ammar al-Mawsili who moved from Baghdad to Qahira. He performed cataract surgeries. He actually performed surgeries with students present. There's clinical accounts of it in his book. He discusses 48 eye diseases, and like all of you, he dedicated his work to Imam Hakim. Now, we talked about Ibn Haytham, who brought the theory of optics. And why is that important? Because he was the first to explain that vision occurs when light reflects from an object and passes to one's eyes. He was also the first to demonstrate that vision occurs in the brain rather than in the eyes, which was the belief everywhere else across the world. And last, the point that I want to make, in Fatimi Qahira itself, we know that the Fatimid, at least, they must have had many more, but we have a record of 3 hospitals. So this is a map of Qahira. The first hospital was in front of the Azhar Mosque. It was called the Bimaristan al-Kashashin. And then there was one outside the gate that would treat the people, the local people, outside the palace. This was Fatimid Bimaristan in the Saktiyin area. And then there was a third hospital. Those hospitals developed after the Fatimid period in Qahira. The Imam's Qasr was here. And so when Qahira gets overtaken by Salahuddin, what Salahuddin does is turn Imam's palace into a hospital. And so he kind of changes the center of the Fatimid city, which this was, into more of an urban area, and then he builds his own citadel across. And so this whole area of Imam's palace becomes a functioning hospital, and then it evolves, and then today, if anyone goes to Ziyarat, they'll see this big building, and this is the madrasa of Sultan Qalawun, which was also his hospital, and you can see in the hospital there were physicians' quarters and stations, etc. So the legacy today of the hospital is a legacy that Sayyidina Saifuddin, who many of our grandparents and our fathers, ape farmayu, ke Burhanin Molai farmayu, ke tame doctor bano. Aksar Molai Burhanin ne farmayu ke aksar puchta tha Babaji sahab ne to Babaji sahab doctor nu farmauta tha. And today, that step ahead has created these types of communities across the world. We know that Sayyidina Muhammad Burhanuddin built Safi Hospital in Mumbai, a center right when you walk in. It says ke, sorry. إذا مرضت فهو يشفين. And then we have Sayyidina Mufaddal Saifuddin Aka, who has said most recently in the band that Sheikh Amir Jamali Dr. Sheikh Amir Jamali talked about, is that he wants us, all of us, to become the leaders and the tops in our field. And I hope that together, in my interest in these things and your interest in the medical sciences, I'm hoping that a lot of you will send your children to my institute in Dallas, where we're looking at Islamic culture, Islamic art, Islamic architecture, and Islamic history to understand the greatness of Islamic civilization where you come from. So conclusions, I believe that with Akamola's guidance, with your own tradition of medicine and your own love and passion to treat mu'mineen, which doesn't really come from your Hippocratic oath, it comes from something deeper within your deep spirituality, that this organization can really create a beautiful idea of social medicine for all in our community, based here in the United States, where insurance policies are worse than academia, financial setup, and at the same time around the world, so that mu'mineen can get the health care that they need. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this. And Khuda Ta'ala, Sayyidina Muhammad Saifuddin Aka, ni Umar Sharif ne Qiyam Nadin lag daraz ne daraz kar jana.
History and the shoulders on which we stand, which gives us a renowned sense of humility of our long history. We want to thank you for the work you put into this and for educating us. So on behalf of us, a little token of our appreciation. And Dr. Ali Asgar Bhai has worked very hard on the Institute at UT Dallas. If anybody's interested in learning more about the work that's being done there, please don't hesitate to contact him.